Uh, okay, well, welcome, and it's fantastic to be here with Michael Masterson today, the Managing Director of EverEdge. Thanks for joining us today, Michael.
Hey, look, thanks, Oliver, for the opportunity. And it's always interesting talking to an audience of one at the moment, but hopefully lots of people are going to get to be able to see this. And look, probably to set the scene, I think the title slide probably hopefully sums it up reasonably well, which is, what the F are intangible assets, and really why should you give a and hopefully by the end of this presentation, which I'll try not to put anyone to sleep. If you do, apologies. But is take you guys through, in particular, if you're looking at doing an idea or you're very early onto an idea, one of the things I've found, and I've done over probably 20 startups, and the good news is I haven't lost money on any of them. I haven't made a gazillion dollars out of everyone, but a couple of them are doing really well. And that's outside of the work I do with EverEdge. And it's really easy to find the people, there's a saying in the Valley, which is death by encouragement. Everyone will tell you why your idea is going to work, and it's rah, 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 and yeah. What I've learned over, my last 25 years of being an entrepreneur, including, one of my first startups that we took from 6 of us to 8,000 people in 8 years. And we got bought by a company in the US, New York Stock Exchange listed company called Omnicom, $40 billion company. It's trying to work out why things might not work. And in particular, finding the people who will tell you the stuff why it's not going to work before you go and do it. Either you spend your time or you spend your money. So a lot of the stuff that I'm going to talk to you about today, here's the bad news. You probably already know. But I'm going to try and put it into a frame of reference that you can use these tools in a slightly different way. So the first bit of background I'll give you is, why listen to EverEdge? And I think it's always really important. If you're going to take advice from someone, you don't want to take it from people who give theoretical advice. And I have a saying, when I'm talking to other CEOs, basically don't take advice from anyone who hasn't laid awake at 3 a.m. wondering how to make payroll. Because until you've gone through that, you don't really know what it's like to run a business. So EverEdge has been going for about 13 years. We've worked with well over 1,000 clients. And what that's really saying is that it's not the first time we've been at the rodeo. We've seen, and unfortunately, most of those clients, we've actually unfortunately seen them get it wrong. And so we've developed a lot of knowledge about what doesn't work. And from that, we've been able to work out what does work. In Singapore, for example, we're actually in partnership with the Singapore government. So again, what does that mean? Well, Singapore recognise what I'm about to take you through as being so important to the Singapore ecosystem that Singapore has now announced it wants to be the lead intangible asset economy on the planet. So the stuff I'm going to talk to you about now, the Singapore government has said, we want to be the best at this, to the point where we literally have co-branded business cards in Singapore. And if any of you guys were in Singapore, working with us is essentially a mandated program. That's how critical they think it is. So hopefully I can do what we do justice. And a really important point that I want to make throughout the presentation, I'm going to be talking about some really, really big companies and some really small companies. In fairness, I'm probably going to give you some examples of companies that have been able to get to scale, because they've succeeded. And there's some companies that you might actually know. But we do literally work with people who haven't even found their garage yet, maybe like some of you, right up to some people who have had some great success. So what do? We really do 4 things. And I'm going to explain these out a little bit. The first is, well, what even are our intangible assets? The second is that once you know what the asset is, then you can identify what the risk is. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later as well. And then the third is, well, how do I start to increase the value on it and at some point be able to put a value on it so that I can bring external investment in? And the fourth area is, am I the right person to own this asset? I'm going to give you one case study in particular around what your options are there. So some of the ways we get involved with clients, it's either helping them improve their competitive advantage, or in particular, if you're looking for investment, how do you get that valuation up? Or sometimes we're working on the investor side and helping them do due diligence on you. And really, it's about understanding what the value is and what the risk is. So some of the clients that we work with, here's some of them. Now, you'll recognize a whole bunch of these. Out in the US, for example, it's people from like Coca-Cola, Comcast, who's one of the world's biggest companies, people at a local level like Rio Tinto. We're working with a number of pretty cool Western Australian companies at the moment, like Warp Forge and Telus, if you're familiar with those companies. And then, to be honest, most of our clients you'll have never heard of, and that's what's really cool. And if you look at this one logo up here, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but it's a company called AirTrunk. And just put AirTrunk in the back of your head, because this is going to give you a really great example about maybe why you should really listen to some of the stuff I'm going to talk to you about. So let's get into intangible assets. This is the thing that I wake up every morning and go to sleep every night and go, wow, why isn't everyone talking about intangibles? And here's one of the reasons I get frustrated. So 1975, it kind of made sense. By the way we define an intangible asset is really important. So some of you who may come from an accounting background will think, well, hang on, you're talking about the way you might bring an asset, in particular software, onto a balance sheet and you write that asset down over time, which is essentially a tax treatment of an asset. I'm not talking about that. We define an intangible asset by exactly that. It's intangible. You can't kick it with your toe, as opposed to tangibles where you kick them and it does hurt if you kick them. So if we look at this data, this is from the US. So it's the S&P 500 over the last 40 years. So in 1975, no one really cared about intangible assets because tangible assets accounted for about 83% of the value of the S&P 500. So this is things like plant, equipment, machinery, etc. That yellow part that you see there is essentially goodwill. And it wasn't a big enough number, so no one cared. So, okay, so what happens in the 80s and the 90s into the 2000s? The first thing is really obvious. You see the tech companies coming on stream, like the Intels, the IBMs, etc. And of course, they're essentially tangible light. So the other thing that happens is that you also see the US, because remember, this is a US example, offshore its balance sheets predominantly to China. In other words, they sent over the plant, the equipment and the machinery to China, but they didn't just send over the what, they also sent over the how. And this is a really, really, really important thing that I want to get across in today's presentation, because this is something Australian companies are doing, and in particular startups are giving away the how because they think the what protects them. I'm going to talk about this a little bit later. And that's why you see companies like Huawei, for example, that used to be a supplier and now today's competitor to the people they used to supply for, like Nokia, Ericsson, AT&T, and Bell Labs. So, and that's because people won't pay for what they can steal. And that's, again, another really important point. People won't pay for what they can steal. And trust me, they will try and find a way to steal it to avoid paying you for it. And now you see intangibles account for 87% as of 2015. So this data is a little bit old. It's due to be updated shortly. 87% of the value is now held in intangible assets. The way you calculate this number, again, I know most of you are early stage, but just so you can work it out, you take the market cap, less the fixed assets, the debt, and the cash, leaves a really big number, which is your intangible asset value. Here's the crazy bit. The reason we're in partnership with the Singapore government is because we haven't come across anyone else talking about intangible assets. We've been doing this for 13 years. So that yellow part is pretty much us doing things like this in conjunction with the guys at Space Cubed and Plus 8, is to try and give you guys a competitive advantage, which we're going to talk about in a second, as to how you are going to win. So let's use, again, another example. The world's 5 biggest companies. You may have heard of some of these guys. Their collective value is now $4.6 trillion on their balance sheet. Oh, sorry, $4.6 trillion. However, the balance sheet only shows value of $228 billion in tangible assets. In other words, 95% of the value, no one knows what it is, where it is, how it is, who's looking after it, etc. So this is obviously a big end of town example, but remember, every single one of these companies started as someone with an idea. You know, Bezos woke up one morning and went, I think I'm going to sell books. And then, you know, Gates woke up one morning and in Venice, he said, I'm going to work out how to take IBM's code. But these were all individuals who started up with an idea. So let's get into description, because vocabulary is really important. And you guys have probably all heard, and by the way, I use guys as gender non-specific. I'm including the girls there. But CEOs, we typically call it competitive advantage or unfair edge. If you've ever seen the Warren Buffett documentary, he actually refers to it as a moat. And if you haven't seen it, it's a must watch. It is so good. Now, if you go and talk to an accountant, they kind of lump it in this thing called goodwill. Lawyers or patent attorneys will call it IP. But what they're actually all describing is how you generate margin and or market share. We deliberately call it intangible assets because we think that's the best way to describe it. It's a business description rather than a legalistic description. The reason this is a really important point that I want to make to you is that when you're dealing with investors, and you'll hear me talk about this a couple of times, if you think about where most investors have made their money, in other words, the people you're going to be pitching to, they've made it out of typically property, agriculture, light manufacturing, or of course, if you're in WA, it's resources and minerals. And that's really their frame of reference. So these are a lot of the terms they hear, and quite often they'll ask you, they'll say, the first question they often learn to say is, do you have IP? Thinking how clever they are, and they hope you say yes. But then they worked out that that was kind of meaningless because it didn't tell them anything. Then they worked out, do you have patents? And unfortunately, they've probably invested in companies that may have had patents, and that might not be a success. So we've been doing a lot of education for investors, and this is a great opportunity for you to also explain to the investors why you're talking about intangible assets, which leads me into the next slide. So intangibles then break down even further into these buckets, and this by no means is an exhaustive list of buckets. There's a few others as well. But these are ultimately the way you are going to drive your company's performance. It's not your desks, your chairs, your computers. That's not why someone's going to invest into you. They're going to invest into you because you've got something really cool. And initially, it's things like, data, or you may have come up with an algorithm or a system or a process. And ultimately, that's going to lead into brand over time. But initially, brand is often quite weak. The other thing, too, is that patents are quite a small subset of this. And we're going to talk about that in a moment. Now, what's interesting is a lot of people think that this is just about tech companies. However, it's actually as much about manufacturing businesses. In fact, it applies to pretty much every company. The difference is that if I go into a manufacturing company and I say, do you have IP? They'll say no. In fact, the guy's normally wearing blue overalls. And if I say, do you have intangible assets? They say, oh, God, no, bugger off, mate. I say, what about secret sauce? Do you have any secret sauce? Yeah, we've got tons of secret sauce. That's how we make everything work. That's how, we've tweaked our machines and we worked out that we use this. So in other words, things like bill of materials and even the operating manual, which is unfortunately often written on the side of the machine, that's what's giving them that competitive advantage. And remember, competitive advantage, unfair edge are all the same way of saying intangible assets. And intangible assets is really explaining how are you going to drive margin and or market share. So that's a really important point. And then you find it in technology companies, it's just orders of magnitude more. So here's the first example I'd like to give you. So some of you guys may have heard of this company called Instagram. So Instagram, at the time they got bought, had $0 in revenue. They only had about $250,000 in assets, which was probably some nice desk chairs and computers. And they'd only been around for 2 years. Now here's the crazy bit. That photo that you see on the right, that is the 12 staff of Instagram when Facebook bought them for $1 billion. So those people on the right got bought for $1 billion. Now, in fairness, they had some pretty amazing user data, which was one of the reasons why Facebook bought them. The other reason why they were worth that much is because if they didn't, someone like Google or Amazon or Yahoo at the time would have. So in other words, there was competitive pressure which drove that price up. Now let's compare that with another example. At the other end of the spectrum, someone that's very tangible. These guys had $1 billion in revenue, $2 billion in assets, been going for nearly 40 years. And guess what? On the same day Instagram gets bought by Facebook for $1 billion, Mainfreight was also worth $1 billion. And you go, well, hang on, how can that be possible? And it's really straightforward. Tangible assets can't scale at an exponential growth rate. When you hear everyone talk about exponential growth and it's all about exponential growth, what they're actually really talking about is intangible assets, because you can only run a machine 24/7. Yet you come up with a really cool piece of software like Instagram, it's infinitely scalable. And so to give you an example of some companies, this is how long it took these guys to reach $1 billion market cap. So YouTube did it in a year, whereas someone like Harley Davidson, it took them 86 years to get to $1 billion market cap. Now, okay, money grows over time. I get that argument, but it's just to demonstrate the point that on the left, you've got predominantly tangible companies, and on the right, you've got essentially intangible companies. Yep. So what's interesting is that when you actually rank intangible assets in terms of volume and value, Most people, in fact, investors, will normally go straight to patents. That's the most important. And then maybe they'll get to trademarks. Here's how it actually really looks in reality. Your biggest asset right now is your confidential information. In other words, the thinking and not so much the what, but the how about what you're going to do. And then it's probably things like your relationships and then data, and it goes down from there. Now, some of these assets, in fairness, will change over time. In fact, as you grow your company, your brand or your trademark will go from being pretty much worth nothing to begin with, think about Apple, to where it ends up being your most valuable asset over time. So what you then find, and this is a really important insight, is the people that you're pitching to or wanting to invest into your company, they don't know what intangible assets they typically own themselves, let alone what you've got, unless you've explained it. And that also means that they're not familiar with the risks around those intangible assets. Third is they don't know how that's going to drive the financial performance of your company. To give you an example we use, I can go and buy a t-shirt in Pakistan for $1. I can sew on a Prada label and now it's worth $100 magically. But when you look at the profit and loss, you don't see $99 of brand value showing up in the P&L. In other words, the brand gets lost in the numbers. And fourth is they normally then don't know how to extrapolate value out of that. And I'm going to talk about that in a moment. So let's get into the first part, which is value. And this is probably the most important slide I will ever show you. It's the reason I joined EverEdge. So the first part, to be honest, everyone knows. Is it a good idea or is it a bad idea? The bit that every single person misses, and we see this in VCs, PEs, institutionals, and angels. No one asks this question, is do you have a weak or a strong intangible asset position? The reason this is really important, actually for the first part, it's not important, because if you've got a bad idea, well, who cares? No one's going to copy you. The problem you've got is, let's say you've got an amazing idea, but you've got a really weak intangible asset position. It means that everyone's going to copy you. And what that means is that over time, it's a race to the bottom on price. And some of you may be familiar with a company called Uber. You know, Uber has now essentially spent a lot of capital to break the market. And of course, you've got Ola and Grab and every other man and his dog just undercutting them on price. And that's the only differentiator. So the only way that you ultimately win the game is you've got to be in the top right-hand corner where you're really hard and ideally impossible to copy, because that's how you create sustainable margins. Now, do you remember at the start, I said it's all about ROI, return on investment? The reason people are going to give you money is they want to get, ideally, typically at early stage companies, they want to get 20 times their money back. So if they put $100,000 into you, they want to get 20 times that back, because they know that unfortunately a lot of you are going to fail, and that's the kind of returns they're looking for. So if we just take this right-hand side, let's work out how we link the strength of your intangible assets to your ROI. So remember I said it's about whether you've got a weak or a strong intangible asset position. Well, what this is a proxy for is your market share. If you think about it, if you've got a product that is like so hard to copy, you just have to have it. E.g., if you want an Apple iPhone, you have to buy an Apple iPhone. You can't go and buy a Samsung iPhone. You can't get to the App Store through a Samsung, for example, because this is a proxy for that market share. Now, here's where it gets interesting. The strength of your intangible assets, the proxy for your market share, which is a proxy for how much revenue or margin you can charge, which is a proxy for your profit, which is ultimately how you generate an ROI. That is the secret sauce. If you want to know whether you are going to win or lose on the battlefield, and your idea isn't just a great idea, but are you going to make money from your idea, you have to understand this. Now, here's the good news. I'm going to give you some case studies where we saw companies that had weak intangible asset positions, but luckily identified this before they went to market, and they were able to get into a really strong position and end up dominating the field. So let's go through a couple of case studies. So the first is this company had been going for about 30 years. They created a massive data set. Now, I know a lot of you will be just starting out, but this is what success can look like. They wanted to do an exit, and they got told that they might be worth 4 times EBITDA, earnings before interest and tax. Pretty standard valuation metric. However, what was interesting is we got brought in at the 11th hour by one of the investors, and we asked about the data. We said, well, what about the data? Now, by the way, unfortunately, a lot of the time data is not worth anything, contrary to what a lot of people tell you, but that's a whole nother presentation. in this case, the data was worth a lot, and we were able to identify non-trade buyers where that data would be really valuable to them. We ended up helping that company sell their business for 32 times EBITDA. In other words, an 8-fold increase. Now, what was interesting is the buyer didn't want the operating company. They just wanted the data because that's what the data was worth to them. And data is all about finding use cases. Separate conversation. The next one was a company that came up with a game-changing algorithm. Remember I said that sometimes companies go down the wrong path? Well, these guys went and raised a bunch of cash. In fact, tens of millions of dollars. Unfortunately, though, they didn't raise enough cash. They probably needed hundreds of millions of dollars. The company folded, they ran out of cash. The investors came to us and said, look, we've got these kind of rump intangible assets. Are they worth anything? And we said, look, probably not. When we looked at them, though, we were able to identify who the assets would be really, really valuable to. We ended up selling that company for an 8-figure sum. It returned tens of millions of dollars to the investors, and it gave a VC-like return. So a 45x return, not a 20x return, but a 45x return to the investors. Now, the moral of this story is these guys shouldn't have deployed. What they should have done is either sold the idea or licensed it straight away. The next one is, again, big end of town, ignore the numbers. Australasian company what needs to grow outside of Australasia, wants to do a joint venture with a very large US firm. The reason I've included this example is quite often we see small companies negotiating with big companies and they just want their cash. There's a moral to this story, which I'll get to. Now, what was interesting is that both of them were just going to put in 50% cash each. It was a $50 million deal, so $25 million each. The company we were dealing with, the Australasian company, though, was putting in a whole bunch of things like brand, data, designs, in other words, intangible assets. So what we did is we valued the Australasian company's intangibles, we valued the US companies, and it ended up being that the Australasian company's intangibles were really, really valuable. In fact, so valuable, they only ended up putting in $3 million of true goodwill. In other words, it saved them $22 million, which is a lot of money, even for a company this size. Now, this is important for you in reverse, in that if you get a large corporate, let's say a Rio Tinto, investing in you, they're not just putting their money in, they're also investing their brand and essentially almost acting like a product endorsement, which is my next favorite case study. Remember I talked to you about that company called AirTrunk at the very start. So about 4.5 years ago, guy calls me up and says, hey, look, I've come up with a way to run a computer data center cheaper than everyone else. I've been essentially to the accounting firms and most of them have told me to literally go get a job. I'm uninvestable. One of them thought they might be able to get me a valuation of 40 million. I said, okay, what do you do? And sorry, how have you protected it? He said, well, look, I'm going to file a patent on it. And I said, well, hang on, how's the patent going to work? He said, what do you mean? I said, well, you're running a data center. Data centers are really secretive. And the way patents work, the only way you can generate revenue off a patent is by either licensing it to someone or suing someone with it. Now, because he was in a data center, he wouldn't know that someone had taken what he'd put in his patent and was using it in their data center because he could never get access to it. Now, that ruled out being able to patent it. So he said, so the accountants were right. I should go get a job. I said, no. We need to run it as a trade secret. And he said, how do I do that? I said, we'll help you. So that's what he did. He then went to Grant Samuels. They then took the deal to JP Morgan. JP Morgan agreed to underwrite the raise. They went out with an initial valuation that we did of $200 million. Now you might go, well, anyone can write a really big number and look, it's a big addressable market, but yeah, who cares? What is important is that they were able to raise $400 million on a $200 million pre-money. $300 million of that was in debt. At the time, and I think probably still to this day, it was the biggest pre-revenue capital raise ever done. And the reason that we were able to get that value is because we were able to put a narrative around the valuation that explained to the investors, who, by the way, were mostly high net worths and family offices, as to why this guy was going to win. Now, to fast forward, AirTrunk, if you want to go and look at the AFR, Robin ended up selling 78% of that company about 5 weeks ago for $3 billion. This was a company that was pre-revenue. People were telling him to go get a job that 4 years later, because he got his strategy right. Now, if he'd filed a patent, he would never have raised $1. And if he did, he wouldn't have kept it for very long. So this is where getting your strategy right, remember, going from a weak intangible asset position to a strong intangible asset position, can end up meaning you're the dominant player and that you can then extrapolate that back to an ROI. This next one was a drug company that we were dealing with, come up with a way to combine two known drugs. Their patent attorney had told them not to get a patent, which is not that common, because the patent was going to be really, really narrow. In other words, you could have just got around the patent by changing the formulation. We then said to him, well, where else have you got to? And he said, well, actually, I've done my clinical trials. And we said, well, therefore, you've got a whole bunch of clinical data. Yep. And where are you at? Well, actually, I'm about to get my FDA approval. So that's a regulatory approval. Remember when I went through those buckets at the start? I said regulatory approvals are really powerful. Data is really powerful. And I said, well, what about when you combine the drugs? Can you just literally mix them together? And he said, well, no, you've got to actually mix them in a specific way. And that's a system or a process or a trade secret. So intangible assets are really interesting. Often, as like fingers, they're quite weak. It's not until you put them into a fist they become quite strong. So we said, well, okay, you've got data, you've got a regulatory approval being your FDA, you've got a manufacturing process. Now, if you actually do put a narrow patent around it, that will become like a fist. And that's exactly what they did. And they were able to grow the company as a result of that strategy at a compounded annual growth rate of about 50-odd%, so to $350 million. So this is real rubber on the road. And that product, by the way, has now been licensed to, I think, about 128 countries around the world. So one of the ways you build value is the traditional approach is you take the fixed assets and the cash, which is what generates your cash flow. That's that kind of mechanistic 4 times EBITDA. It's a bit like riding an old school BMX. You've just got to pedal faster if you want to get a better rate of return. The only way you can get a higher rate of return is you've got to create strategic value. And that comes about through your intangible assets. You can't do it through tangibles because remember, they can't scale exponentially. So this is a bit like adding a gearing ratio to the back of your bike. So you just change the gears. You pedal the same amount, but you're getting a much higher rate of return. Now, unfortunately, there's an opposite side to the coin, which is it's also the greatest source of risk. And I'm going to take you through some quick case studies on it now. Hopefully no one's fallen asleep. So the top 5 risks that we see pretty much across every company we deal with, whether it's literally the person who's just come up with their first idea, about to go and work on it in their garage, right through to Fortune 100, is they leak like a sieve. They often end up telling people what their idea is, etc. The second is they can't prove that they actually own the idea. I'm going to give you some quick examples of these. The third is around using tools, which sometimes be a good or a bad thing. And then the fifth is that the fourth is they often don't own their brand. The fifth one I'm actually not going to cover because again, early stage companies, it's normally, if you go to the US, the short story is it's not if you're going to be sued, it's when. But these are sort of order of priority. If you can get the first 4 right, we'll talk to you about the fifth. So the first one about them leaking like a sieve. So they typically leak in 3 particular areas, either talking to customers, talking to suppliers, or when you bring on employees. And I'll give you an example of this. This was a company about 15 years ago. They'd created some game-changing hardware. In fact, they dominated the entire category. If you wanted this particular piece of hardware, you had to buy it from these guys. They were growing so fast, they couldn't keep up with hiring enough software engineers. Unbeknownst to the management team, the engineering team went and found some German software coders. To the Germans' credit, they delivered it on time, on budget. The company continues to grow. They need to do the next iteration. So again, the engineering team say, hey, let's go get those German guys again. Unfortunately, they couldn't find them. In fact, they ended up popping up 6 months later with 25 million euro VC. And they ended up competing with the original company that they were writing for, and they actually ended up dominating the entire category. And unfortunately, it ended up costing, now this is 15 years ago, it cost the company at the time about $150 million. So this was really well-intended kind of approach to solving a problem with unintended consequences. And unfortunately, we do see this happen a lot. Because remember, if something's really valuable, people will try to steal it. So second is they can't prove they own their assets. And if you remember, this is exactly what happened at Facebook. You know, Facebook started off with the 2 developers and then Zuckerberg came along and then there was the dispute and they had to get paid out. And what often happens is because, as we found with this company, normally a standard investor warranty that people will ask you when they're going to put money into your business is, can you prove you own your assets? And in particular, as you get bigger, that will become more and more onerous, and they'll want more and more details about you being able to prove you own your assets. And that's exactly what happened, unfortunately, with this company. So they were raising 36 million. This was a Series C, so again, slightly advanced compared to where maybe you guys are at, on 120 million pre-money. And of course, they got asked to prove they own their assets. Unfortunately, they hadn't actually tracked how the software had got developed, and they'd used a number of external engineers to write part of the code. They'd had a bunch of staff leave. They hadn't documented that process. They also had some people that probably brought some code from former employers. And it was kind of like this Gordian knot. You couldn't actually undo it. Unfortunately, that meant that the investment failed. And unfortunately, because that investor pulled away, the company actually ended up falling over. So I'm not saying go out and engage lawyers and write copious amounts of agreement stuff. All I'm saying is just be aware of this and start to create an audit trail. And things like even your Slack notes as you're developing can be really powerful here. Third, I mentioned about, unfortunately, half the companies we know don't own their trademark. Here's a quick 101 on how trademarks work. There's two kinds of a trademark. There's what's called a device mark and a word mark. So let's take McDonald's. The word McDonald's is the word mark, obviously. But the golden arches, their logo, is the device mark. Okay, so you might get a trademark for one, or you may get a trademark for both, but having one doesn't give you automatic rights over the other. And this, unfortunately, is what happened to this company. So this is an ASX 100 company, you know, getting good advice from lawyers and trademark attorneys, etc. And unfortunately, in the first meeting, the CEO was telling us how they were spending $1.5 million a month to grow their the market in Australia, because what they were going to do was grow their brand in Australia and then leapfrog into the US using the same brand. Literally, within 5 minutes of doing a pretty basic search, we identified that they didn't own their device mark or their word mark in the US, but in their home mark being Australia, they didn't own the word mark. In other words, they didn't own their name. They owned their logo. And to get around a logo is actually really easy. What was worse is in the US, their main competitor had already registered their word mark and their device mark, their logo. And that meant that they were never going to be able to use that brand ever in the US. And unfortunately, it meant they'd invested $36 million into a brand that they could never own. Again, really well-intended advice, but unintended consequences. I mentioned about open source. Some of you I know will be looking at using open source, and we're not saying open source is bad. That open source can be great. There's three things to check. One, make sure you've got ownership of the code through the license. Second is actually read the license. Make sure that there's no gotcha in there. And quite often we find that there is some quite malicious code that's put into open source where you innocently put it in. Whilst you're not generating revenue, it's okay. The moment you start to become generating revenue, e.g. a commercial entity, they can end up owning your code base. And the third is often it's the easiest way to get a backdoor into your code. So this one, this quick one, again, big end of town. This is a PE firm, you know, people who normally know what they're doing. They've done traditional due diligence, lawyers and accountants. The only problem was that the asset they bought was a software company, and they paid $100 million for this software company. Of course, the biggest asset is the code. No one had done what's called an open source code check on it. We got one of the firms we work with to do an open source code check. Guess what? We absolutely found open source, and we unfortunately did find some pretty nasty code in there. The good news is the bad guys hadn't worked that out yet. We were able to get the client to swap out the bad code, replace it with good code. But the fundamental of the story is essentially these guys have put $100 million into buying an asset they hadn't done any relevant due diligence on. In other words, it's about learning to ask the right questions. So look, just to surmise on this, the first thing I'd say to you is work out where you're at in this kind of progression. What we find is that a lot of companies we deal with, unfortunately, a lot of early stage companies say we have no IP. Now, here's the bad news. If you have no IP, what are they investing into? So that's why I talk about intangibles, because you've got lots of intangible assets. The first thing to do is work out that, hey, you've got those intangible assets and work out how you're going to protect them. What typically then happens is that you then start thinking about, well, okay, well, how do we start to think forward and actually use those to create more profit? And that might be through out licensing. And then you might want to end up like an Apple or a Google, creating an app store and then creating an ecosystem. And that's typically how companies progress up the chain. So what are the questions that I'd ask if I was you running your business? Well, the first one's pretty obvious. What are our intangible assets? And more importantly, who's managing them? Second of all is, what's our strategy about how to use our intangible assets to drive growth And more importantly, does it actually integrate with our business strategy? And also in terms of how we're going to raise capital. The third is, what's your level of risk? I mean, obviously at an early stage company, you've got to take risk because you don't have the cash to be able to go out and file all the patents you need or to do some of the work that you might need to do, for example. And, sometimes we find companies are going too slow. They're not taking enough risk. In other words, raising enough capital to go fast enough. One, and this is just general Michael advice, big mistake I've made is don't ever take advice from people who benefit from their own advice. So I'll be honest, going to a patent attorney and saying, do I need a patent? Is like going to your barber and saying, do I need a haircut? The answer will be yes. Same if you go to your accountant and saying, do I need accounting? They'll set up trust structures, and same with the lawyers. So try to work with people, such as the folks at SpaceCube, that they're not benefiting from their advice. When they're talking to you, there's no outcome for them. Another big one, have they actually done it? Or have they just read the book or gone to the school or studied innovation or commercialization? You want to find the people that have probably failed a few times and have got some great war stories. And there's some fantastic mentors within SpaceCube that have got lots of war stories. And if they don't, I've got plenty for you. And then also making sure that you're actually explaining to your investors where the value is coming from. And in particular, remembering that their frame of reference is property, light manufacturing, agriculture, or again, probably mining where you guys are. So again, you've got to put it into a language and a narrative that they can understand. And also make sure that whoever's doing the valuation actually understands what intangible assets are. And I'll be really honest, I am yet to meet an accountant who can read a patent or who can tell me really what a trade secret is or how to protect the trade secret. So in other words, if you don't know how the tools work, it's really hard to then value the house. So just to sort of sum up, you guys do have a fiduciary responsibility about how to do this because the investors are trusting you. And your first responsibility, because you're about to become a director or maybe you already are, is to protect and manage the assets on behalf of the investors. So the first thing is work out what they are, come up with how you're going to make some money out of them, work out what the risks are around them, and more importantly, come up with how you're going to mitigate those. So look, one of the ways we often work with companies is, and this is the program that we do with every company in Singapore, is we help you guys understand this at a much deeper level. What have we got? What are our risks? But most importantly, how are we going to build value over time? Because valuation is only ever relevant when you're doing a capital event. In other words, you're doing a raise, a divestment, an IPO. So lots of people say to us, hey, can you help us with evaluation? And which is great, but often we find when we go do a valuation, they haven't done a lot of the stuff that we work out here, which is have you mitigated the risks? E.g., do you own your brand? Have you protected your idea in the right way, etc. And unfortunately, that can have a massive impact on your valuation, either down or up. So look, what we're more than happy to offer is that, look, we spend an hour with anyone who wants to have a chat with us. And if I'm being honest, probably most of the time we might help you understand maybe why you shouldn't do the idea or maybe why you've got to take a different approach. So look, feel free to reach out to the guys at +8 and SpaceCube or get in contact with us direct. But look, I hope that was interesting and everyone's still awake.
Wide awake, and yeah, it's definitely opened my eyes to a lot of new aspects that I've never thought about, Michael. So yeah, that was fantastic. Thank you so much.
No, that's great. I love it. But as I said, this is literally, I wish I could go back to me, let's say 20 years ago and explain this stuff, because those startups that I did, I probably wouldn't have done half of them, and the other half I would have done completely differently. And I probably would have just bought the island next to Branson. This really is the stuff that people get wrong all the time. And it's not that people are trying to give you bad advice. It's just unintentionally bad advice because it's often at the wrong stage of your development. And as you know, when you're an early stage company, cash is king. And if you don't do your due diligence first, the first thing you do is due diligence before you start doing your R&D. And when I'm talking about due diligence, I'm not talking about accounting and legal. I'm talking about not just can I do my idea, but should I do my idea? And once you've got confidence that I should do my idea, then you've got the confidence to raise capital, to start employing people to do R&D. And then the next step is commercialization, where it gets really expensive. You've got to jump on planes or VC at the moment. So again, the point I really want to emphasize is get someone who's got the experience to do the due diligence, whether it's someone like us or there's a few other people out there, but try and make sure they're unencumbered by their advice and try and make sure that they've actually been there, done it before. They haven't just read the book.
That's perfect. And a perfect note to wrap up on. So thank you so much, Michael. I really appreciate your time today.
Awesome, Oliver. Hey, look, thanks again for the opportunity, and look forward to turning each of you into a case study. So hopefully one of the good ones, not the bad ones.